I want to know how the Kevin guy who applied for this position, how he kind of looked at the National Arts Centre and appraised it and said, well, what are the chances? What do I have to fit into? What can I change? What will I be stuck with? How much of that were you able to do before you said yes?
Well, that's a good question. I think when Peter Herndorf and the NAC folks gathered us all on the stage of the theater in 2015 for the first conversation about the creation of an Indigenous theater here, I was skeptical. It's like, well, what does that mean? Like, what does that look like?
He flew in people from around the country?
Yeah,
for the conversation.
I mean, Indigenous theater sort of came out of the summit, and then was it the Gathering, where we did this thing at Manitoulin Island, where, and it was all driven by English theater at the time. So Gillian Kiley, under her tenure, with Sarah Stanley, and so out of that gathering came this idea of creating an Indigenous theater. I think Corey Payette was also involved in a lot of that work as well in the early days. But anyways, out of that gathering came this idea that what the NAC really needs to do to evolve and to recognize like the work, because at this gathering we did basically they listed the breadth of the Indigenous canon in this country, all the shows, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of shows, many of which got like one showing,
right,
and then disappeared forever. And so just because of the lack of support, like the infrastructure, we don't have the same infrastructure as the rest of the country, the French and the English, right? The founding nations of Canada. The Indigenous, again, right from the foundation of the nation building project is set out in the Massey Papers, the Indigenous arts were discouraged, other than doing things that were approved by, like doing things that were touristy, right? And so out of that gathering came this idea of Indigenous theater. And so when they brought that proposal to Peter Herndorf, and he said, yes, let's do that, they invited a bunch of us from across the country in a big circle on the stage, and they presented that idea. And in that meeting, I mean, people came up to you, oh, you look really skeptical. I had lots of really hard questions about, well, what does this look like?
And was Herndorf new to this idea, or he had already cooking on it?
No, he was new to it. I mean, he was new enough but he was cooking on it enough to have said yes. He'd already agreed to do it. So it was still a brand new idea, and they still had to go through the process of, like, the hiring process and
And what were your reservations?
Well, I mean, what does that mean? What does an Indigenous theater at the National Arts Centre of Canada mean? Is it? I mean, the one of the stickiest problems of the NAC, from my perspective, was it's the National Arts Centre of Canada in Ottawa, right? It plays to the Ottawa audience. That's ultimately its function.
It's the Ottawa Big Theatre.
Yeah, it's a national theatre, but it has a very, for the most part, it struggles to get beyond its own walls. And so there's been a lot of, and what I learned is that there have been a lot of efforts to get it beyond its walls, but it's a heavy lift to do so. And there are departments that are much more resourced and successful at doing that. And there's, like, the education department is really great at getting beyond the walls of the NAC. And
you mean taking artists across the country, or bringing artists in from across the country?
Taking artists into community, like into small communities, into different regions, and doing digital outreach and doing personal outreach, and bringing artists like to remote communities and doing workshops with musicians and things like that. The education department, which was born from the orchestra, the musical education department, has been very good at that. Now it's evolved into a broader arts education department. But the NAC as an institution has, I think, had a hard time reaching beyond its own walls. It's typically, like most institutions, it focuses inward.
Is that a money problem?
It's a perspective problem. It's like, what's the role of an institution? And what's the role of a theater? It's to put bums in seats and to get people in the building, right? If that's your marketing focus, that's the role that the organization is going to do. Right. But to go back to your earlier question, Kevin Loring, when he was looking at this thing, I don't like talking about myself in the third person, me looking at this thing, this project, and how I would approach it? Well, I said, my initial impulse was, well, I want to turn this building inside out. I want to have 1 foot in the community and 1 foot on stage. And for the most part, it's been limited in my tenure, partly because we got nailed by the pandemic, and also the resources have been tight for my department. And so that's a struggle. It's very expensive. It can be very expensive to get outside and to travel artists outside into community and to do all that kind of work that I had. My impulse was when I took on this job. It still remains, but I don't yet have the capacity within our department or the resourcing to be able to really act on that in a meaningful way yet. I still have that goal in mind, and we've been doing that in a more local sense. And so we have Mari Brakupe, who's our sort of community engagement person, who's herself a brilliant artist, who does a lot of that work that is non-theater based. It's like doing beading workshops in the building and making, again, that idea of making this space a welcoming space for Indigenous community and artists. We have an Indigenous Women's Art Market coming up in the next week or so, which is not a theater event, but it's a way for us to reach out to the community and to bring Indigenous people into the building in a really great way, and then have the conversation. We have an amazing season. Come check us out. Come see our work. And it gives those artists, those artisans, a space within the NAC and a footprint here.
Other theaters are trying to make their theaters into community spaces, meaning we're not just a place that turns the lights on at 6 o'clock at night and does a show and everybody goes home. It's a place where the community comes all day to do this or that.
Yeah.
So, but is there the community big enough in Ottawa for that? I mean, the little coffee shop now is a place you want to go and sit because you can look out the windows. But
I would say that in the before times, before the renovations to all the beautiful public spaces we have now, I mean, these, this concreteness was the outside wall. That's what the community saw, a brick, like a concrete fortress that looked like it could survive a nuclear blast. Right? It was built in the Cold War. And now, I was, in the building last night, and there was people dancing in the Peter Herndorf place, the sort of open space there, and there are events all the time happening here, not just conferencey events, but wonderful engagement events for a community to come and hang out. It's a busy, alive space now, in a way that it wasn't when I was first working here as an actor in the 2000s.